Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening if you are joining from Europe or Asia. I'm Jitesh Vittal, Program Director for Data Science and Technology Initiative at MDICx. We have an amazing panel here to discuss about the cybersecurity concerns for medical devices. This webinar will be recorded, and we would love to see your comments and questions while we are on session. You can use the Q&A button on the Zoom screen or use the chat option. Our panelists will go through it after they complete the prepared slides. Now I turn over to Ms. Pamela Goldberg, who is the CEO and President for the MDICx for her opening remarks.
Well, I'm thrilled that we're having this conversation today. We've been talking about this for a couple of months. It's having recognized the importance of cybersecurity to the device industry over a period of time. We were anxious to do some research with some key partners that you'll hear from today, and have produced that report and that you'll hear more about today. But we're really excited to share this information with you and have the conversation today. I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne Schwartz from the FDA. Suzanne, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Pamela. It is indeed for me and for FDA really a delight to participate in this webinar. As folks know, coordinated vulnerability disclosure is a very important topic to us, and as MDICx embarked on a first effort to address an area within this huge challenge space of medical device cybersecurity, what better place to really begin in terms of looking to drive change and have an impact. So I'm delighted to participate, and what I'm really going to do, and by way of framing in a 10 minutes or so or less, is really just give an overview of FDA and what we've been doing over the past year, kind of an overarching picture. Now, Tesh, I am having some difficulty. Okay, great. I'm going to have to ask you to move the slides for me because I'm unable to really get to the controls right now. Okay. So if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. It's been a very busy year for us this past year, and there's a lot that has really been accomplished through 2018, and then we'll look forward to what's up and coming in 2019. I'd be remiss, however, to state that this is FDA acting alone. FDA, from the very beginning of our efforts in cybersecurity going back years ago, stated that this is a whole of community approach, that we have to look towards building partnerships, fostering collaboration, and working with the private sector and other partners within the public sector as well in order to move the needle. And those who've heard me speak have heard me say over and over again, shared responsibility, shared accountability space. So in April of this year, FDA did issue a safety action plan, which covered a number of different priority areas. And I'm glad to say that advancing medical device cybersecurity was a key priority area to include in the safety action plan. And it's important because a lot of times people do think of cybersecurity as somewhat separate from safety and therefore from FDA's mission in terms of protecting and promoting public health. And yet we know, and we've seen as this space has continued to evolve, as the threat landscape has continued to emerge, that there's a crossover point where cybersecurity impacts on patient safety. And that is an area of great interest and great concern for FDA, working together with the ecosystem partners. Also thought that educating and further informing clinicians who are also important partners with respect to emerging areas in cybersecurity would be important in terms of really changing the culture of the healthcare community in general and understanding what the important principles are with respect to devices and vulnerabilities that might emerge over the lifetime of that device. And so that's something, while we've issued a few pieces, commentaries and perspective pieces in various journals over the course of 2018, we'll be looking forward also into 2019, further engaging with the professional societies, with the clinical audience, to further inform, to further outreach and consider as partners in this area. As noted, I want to highlight the reason that we're here today for this webinar is the publication that came out on October 1st, which you'll be hearing much more about as a deep dive on advancing coordinated vulnerability disclosure. To us, being able to advance this space is one that can make a significant difference in improving the posture of the ecosystem. And yet it had been such a foreign concept and so novel to many. And in really socializing this concept, whether we've done this through guidance and through meetings and workshops, it is clear to us that there were impediments, that there have been barriers that have been brought to our attention in talking to various industry members. And that's why this analysis in this report becomes so critical in being a driver for change. Just last month, the commissioner made some really bold statements, which were evidence of a strong commitment to the agency's efforts to bolster medical device cybersecurity. And it is just outstanding to have a commissioner who has been so highly supportive of the direction that we have been pursuing here at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. That commitment was articulated, and in addition to that, in the statement that was published, what was also rolled out was a publication that FDA participated in with MITRE. And this was the release of a playbook that would serve as a tool, a customizable tool for healthcare delivery organizations so that they can be better poised to deal with incidents around medical devices that might be in some ways breached or exploited, and how might they respond to those events? Well, it is all about preparedness. It is all about readiness and putting things in place in advance, and practicing and exercising and defining what those gaps are and then closing those gaps. So this was another deliverable that was just released. And then in the way of, again, fostering collaboration, the importance of really bringing the ecosystem to work closely together. Information sharing is a principal element, a principal component. And our efforts around growing the ecosystem with respect to additional ISAOs, information sharing analysis organizations, that would work together with the agency, with the public, with the healthcare ISAC, has been a strategy of ours since we released the post-market guidance in 2016. And so 2 additional ISAOs were formed, were established, and MOUs were announced with regard to those. And we look forward to seeing more MOUs come out with additional ISAOs over the next year. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, and then 2 really additional important milestones for the agency. We did just release a draft pre-market guidance, which is an update to the 2014 one that was issued as final several years ago. And one point that I really would want to leave folks with here is that the original 2014 guidance really stands as a foundational document upon which we have built further and advanced the dialogue, if you will, around cybersecurity with respect to pre-market controls, how to design into a device on the pre-market side what is presently considered, what is presently viewed as a rigorous and robust security. And the current draft really calls out the importance of documentation within the pre-market submission. And there's an opportunity to hear more about that and to discuss that. We'll be spending 2 days in our workshop that we'll be holding in January on the 28th and 29th. That will allow all of our stakeholders to provide their comments and thoughts and hear more and more about that guidance. A couple of things also just to note about the guidance as well is that 3 basic building blocks upon which we have built, and that is the concept of trustworthiness of devices, transparency, and resilience. And really all 3 are not just purely device-centric, but they have to do with how we think about cybersecurity in general through the entire product lifetime. And finally, we executed a memorandum of agreement with the Department of Homeland Security, which in many ways really institutionalizes the relationship that we have had with DHS, specifically their industrial control system, CERT now called the MDICx, over the past several years, and allows us to further grow that relationship and expand it as we consider what might be opportunities coming up in the future. Next slide. Okay, I think, yeah, that's it. That will be our last slide, which really talks about what we have forward-leaning, looking ahead in 2019, work that we had initiated a couple of years ago on developing what would be kind of a translation of the CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, so that it lends itself to the clinical environment and is more applicable to medical devices, is an effort that has been underway, utilizing the community as participants in it. We're looking forward to that effort further developing to the point of submitting as a MDDT, a medical device development tool, for qualification by the FDA, so that that would be an open source tool that can be used. In addition to that, a number of other public-private partnership efforts that have been underway that I know MDIC has been participating in as well, including the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council's group that's specifically dedicated to driving the medical device efforts around greater security and resilience in medical devices. So there will be, further work done there, and as you can see, also efforts that it will expand more globally, utilizing IMDRF, and a short public service announcement here for our interest in expanding participation this coming year in August 2019 in the DEF CON Biohacking Village. We'll be really looking for more manufacturers to participate in that, once more utilizing coordinated vulnerability disclosure. And with that, I believe that the slides will be available afterwards. So I think what I'll do is I'll turn that back to Randy at this point to continue.
Very good. I'll assume you can hear me fine. So introduce myself, Randy Schistel. I work at Boston Scientific Corporation in our corporate organization responsible for global technology. First of all, thank you, Pamela, Suzanne, and Jitesh for setting this up and setting the stage. Suzanne, we sincerely appreciate your personal engagement and leadership as we all work to ensure the safety of our medical devices that we bring to market. And thank you in advance to Deb Bavoy and Plimpton and Alvarez and Massell for their professional response to the RFP that was put out by MDIC and the research that you'll hear about upcoming here in this webcast. The effort is really a good example of where MDIC adds value to the healthcare ecosystem by bringing industry and government together and sponsoring projects like this one, coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So as you can see on the slide, a few of the responsibilities that I have at Boston Scientific, but more importantly, lower right, I'm a founding member of the MDIC board and board champion for technology to include computational modeling and cybersecurity. Jitesh, go ahead to the next slide. So just a couple of comments up front here. As an industry representative, the coordinated vulnerability disclosure creates tremendous benefit to the healthcare ecosystem, and especially for med device suppliers. If you look to the left, just a quick summary on communications, transparency, the ability to intake feedback and research from others in the industry or even outside the industry that have feedback on our devices. Awareness to the full community, to the physicians, to the public, remediation of any problems that are found, the partnerships that we create with researchers and the FDA, and first and foremost, patient safety. Having coordinated vulnerability disclosure capability within a company really does set the stage for a solid, professional, complete, thorough process. And to the lower right, the internal benefits that may not become totally apparent to everyone as they start down this journey is really aligning roles and responsibilities, creating a good, consistent process within the company. We've really benefited through the cross-functional engagement and cross-divisional collaboration that we've seen in the company to really bring cybersecurity to the forefront of our discussions, not only for commercial devices that are on the market, but even more importantly, those devices that are in development, set the right security architecture up front. Then thorough assessment and alignment, clearly part of our broad risk management campaign, and a strong opportunity to communicate clearly and openly with C-level and board members as we bring forth the work that we do around product security and demonstrate that that is a priority for the company. Next slide. So here was the proposal that was put out for industry to respond to, sponsored by MDIC, recognizing that cybersecurity is a critical infrastructure vital to the US. And threats can have a debilitating effect on security, economic security, and public health and safety. MDIC focused on making meaningful contributions to advanced cybersecurity as related to med device. And the next paragraph was really the statement of work, looking for a contractor to synthesize case studies and learnings from med device companies, large, small, combined, and other stakeholders that have already implemented vulnerability reporting, and looking for best practices and processes to create this report. Presented briefly at our annual public forum, and now more thoroughly here in this MDICx webcast. So our bottom line, we're all working together, industry and government and all stakeholders, to advance coordinated vulnerability disclosure and create good, consistent processes and share those best practices in order to really develop a strong capability across all of med device. It is a critical need for the public, for all of our physician and healthcare stakeholders, but totally for the industry. in total. It's so important that we make sure that we are responsive as members of the industry, that we provide that safety and security priority as we bring any device to market. So with that, we'll turn it over to the team to give us a thorough review of the report findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. And hello, everyone. I'm Luke Demboski. I co-chair the Cybersecurity and Data Privacy practice at Debevoise and Plimpton, where a law firm works on these issues. I'm joined by my fellow co-chair of the practice, Jeremy Fagelson, who's based in New York. Also, our partner here in Washington, D.C., where I am, Paul Rubin, who heads our FDA practice. And we also have one of our very trusted partners on these issues, John DeCrane, who's Senior Director of Alvarez and Marcel. As will become quickly apparent if it hasn't already, these issues are very interdisciplinary. And so you've heard from Suzanne at FDA, from Randy on the manufacturing side. MDIC has graciously brought all of us together to talk about the different angles of this. And so what we thought we would do is bring this interdisciplinary group that includes lawyers, includes cybersecurity professionals like John from Alvarez, includes risk professionals as well, along with Suzanne from FDA, to work through a problem set that we're going to get to in a second. So if we could go to our first slide here. You see our backgrounds that you have, and go ahead forward. So one of the things that we were very grateful to be invited to do by MDIC is to put together a report around coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies, or CVD policies, as Randy has mentioned. This is really a cutting-edge initiative for which MDIC gets all the credit to bring us together and really organize industry discussion on this important area. We'll let you look at the report for yourself. It's available on the MDIC website. Near and dear to our heart, as a few of us are the lawyers in the room on these issues, you can see on the slide the broad range of legal issues that come into play here. FDA, of course, is front and center, and that's always been true in this space. But now we have many others jumping in, not just on cybersecurity in general, but on specific issues related to these types of innovations, like we're talking about with medical devices. So the SEC issued guidance recently about disclosure of material vulnerabilities in general in cyber, and they're very active on these issues. Of course, HHS's department's focused on this in enforcing HIPAA guidelines and disclosure obligations is active. The FTC was an early entrant in the space, probably the first major regulator jumping in on cyber-related enforcement issues. Against the backdrop that we have our product liability issues, federal and state laws in the United States. We're going to touch, by the way, on the European GDPR, which, for those that don't know, is the landmark privacy law really in the world. And it's come into effect this past spring and caused a lot of companies across sectors to really think about what they're doing and make changes related to cyber and data privacy. And of course, underlying all of it are contractual implications. So let's go ahead. I'm going to turn it over to Paul Rubin, our partner here, who heads the FDA practice at Debevoise.
Thank you, Luke. What I thought I would do is just take a few minutes and summarize our report before we turn to the hypothetical case study that Luke mentioned. The report is a lengthy report. It's 36 pages, and as Luke mentioned, it's available at the MDIC website. So we're not going to have an opportunity to delve into all of the details addressed in the report, but we wanted to highlight many of the issues we addressed, in particular those issues related to coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies. So the first question is, what is a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy? In essence, it's a formalized process for obtaining cybersecurity vulnerability information, assessing the vulnerability, remediating the vulnerability, and then disclosing it. The acronym that I've used is ORD, forgive the New York accent, OARD, obtaining, assessing, remediating, and disclosing. Now, what are the benefits associated with a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy? There are many, and we just wanted to highlight a few. First, it's always preferable to have a policy than instead to not have one and be forced to rely on ad hoc decision-making, often in a crisis situation, which is the last time you want to have to make ad hoc decisions. Another important benefit relates to patient health and safety. You want to have an organized policy to receive, vet, and remediate vulnerabilities when you become aware of them. It just makes sense to have a preset policy. And finally, there are very important legal reasons for having a CVD policy, which we'll address in a few minutes. But I would highlight that under FDA's post-market cybersecurity guidance, FDA is clear that medical device manufacturers should adopt a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy. That's on page 18 of the post-market guidance. Another thing we're going to talk about is the use of online portals to receive vulnerability information. It is the preferable approach that has been adopted by those companies who've already implemented, by many of the companies, in fact, the vast majority, who've implemented CVD policies. One of the important points we need to make is that portal must be secure, and we address some of those issues in our report. In addition, on pages 25 and 26 of our report, we identify a number of suggested disclosures that companies should consider making if they establish an online portal, and these disclosures provide a range of legal protection and are also important from a practical perspective. We can go to the next slide. So one important thing to keep in mind is that unlike other industries that adopt CVD or coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies, medical device companies need to interact with FDA. And what that means is that everything we're talking about today, and when we address coordinated vulnerability disclosure, it's in the context of existing FDA regulatory requirements. Those requirements do not go away. So for example, medical device companies still need to be cognizant of MDR reporting requirements for adverse events under 21 CFR Part 803, the requirement to report corrective and preventive actions under 21 CFR Part 806, and the distinction between those actions and enhancements. And also you need to keep in mind FDA recall policies and whether a recall would be appropriate. It's also important to keep in mind that FDA can play a very valuable role when it comes to assessing vulnerabilities and determining how and when to disclose them. FDA is chartered to protect the public interest, and FDA's involvement, as we'll discuss today, is often critical in helping to work with industry to ensure that public health is protected and a disclosure is not made too early before a remediation program has been developed, or for that matter, too late. We can go to the next slide. So there's a wide range of legal implications associated with medical device cybersecurity, as well as coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies. And we're highlighting here just a few. So class action lawsuits is obviously a concern for all of our clients, and those lawsuits can be premised on consumer injury, some harm to health, but also the loss of economic value can be the basis for a class action lawsuit. In other words, having access to a device that had an unexpected vulnerability. There's always the risk of criminal enforcement. Those cases are rare, but they do exist. Companies are subject to criminal enforcement But in addition, because we're dealing with the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, there's the responsible corporate officer doctrine, whereby under the Park decision and its progeny, responsible corporate officers can also be held criminally liable. So that's an underlying context for everything we're talking about today. There's also privacy reporting obligations and lawsuits that we'll talk about in more detail. There's the possibility of product liability exposure that we'll talk about. And then for publicly traded companies, the SEC has been very active and has issued guidance regarding cybersecurity disclosures and when companies need to make a disclosure to the public markets from an SEC requirement. One item that's not on this slide that I wanted to mention is the risk of congressional investigations. This has been top of mind from a public policy perspective. Just last week, Senator Grassley sent a letter to the Food and Drug Administration asking a wide range of questions regarding the FDA's cybersecurity program. And if Congress is asking questions of FDA, you can be assured that Congress will not hesitate to ask questions of private industry. So next slide. Some best practices for adoption of CBD policies. These practices were based upon on our interviews with medical device companies. And again, we're just highlighting a small set of the best practices, a much lengthier list available in the report. But one important item to think about is the corporate culture. It's very important for the company, the C-suite, upper-level management to embrace the concept of a CBD policy and to appreciate the benefits exceed the risks. Organizational structure is something that must be considered. Many companies reported to us that they found it's preferable to have direct reporting from product security teams to the C-suite, but that of course will vary based on the structure of each company. As we prepared this report, it became obvious that there's no cookie cutter approach to any of these issues, and everything is very individualized to each company. In addition, it's important to memorialize the CBD policy and standard operating procedures, or SOPs. As you know, FDA's perspective on these issues is that if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. And that's the same thing with your CBD policies, and they should be interwoven with existing SOPs. And lastly, we just wanted to mention, before turning to the hypothetical, the concept of how to interact with security researchers. These are the folks who may conduct testing on your device and report a vulnerability. The initial instinct is often negative, and you feel like you want to be adversarial to them. But based on our interviews, everyone uniformly reported to us that at least in the first instance, it's very important to treat these security researchers with respect and provide them with regular updates. And remember that FDA's involvement can be helpful because FDA can often coordinate between the interests of the security researcher and the company and public health. So with that, I want to turn it to my partner, Jeremy Fagelson, who will take the lead in walking us through the hypothetical where we can elucidate the issues we've just discussed.
Thanks, Paul, and hello, everybody. It's nice to be with you. As Luke and Paul have said, I'm Jeremy Fagelson. I'm a partner in the New York office at Debevoise, and with Luke, I co-chair our global practice in cybersecurity and data privacy. What we thought we would do from here to the rest of our time with you is take you through a scenario, which we hope will be useful and lively, even a little bit fun, and a good way of bringing some of these issues to life for you in a practical way. So on the slide that you see now, we're going to introduce to you our hypothetical company, BeatPro Technologies. They make pacemakers, and the pacemakers have connectivity in two directions. A doctor can remotely adjust the pacemaker, and the pacemaker can send data back to the doctor. So the device is living inside the patient, but it's connected still to the doctor's office through the internet. So let's jump quickly to slide 22. And we're going to introduce you to the Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, introducing a bit of jargon for you, of BeatPro. And our CISO is attending something called Black Hat. More on that in a second, but it's a big cybersecurity conference, which really happens. And he hears a presentation that wakes him up and scares him a little bit because the security researcher, Mr. Red Teamer, shows at the conference that he's been able to hack the competition's pacemaker. And not wanting to be caught in the same way and have a presentation like this at next year's Black Hat be about BeatPro, the CISO starts thinking about how BeatPro can better position itself to protect against, to detect and protect against vulnerabilities like this. And part of the chatter at Black Hat and generally in the security community is about whether we should have a CVD program at our hypothetical company. And so our CISO starts to explore those issues in partnership with the general counsel and other stakeholders at the company. Now, before we turn to our questions on the next slide, John DeCrane from Alvarez and Marcel, who's our forensic expert and teammate on this project. John, I want to invite you to say a little bit about Black Hat and Mr. Red Teamer. What is Black Hat? Who are these people who speak at something like Black Hat, like Mr. Red Teamer? Is this hypothetical really hypothetical?
No, I think it's real life. Thank you for asking the question, Jeremy. Glad to be here. I think Black Hat is one of several major conferences, which are sort of the pinnacle of yearly efforts by these researchers and other folks. Right, these researchers exist in a number of industries, medical device only being one of those. Researchers are participating year-round. They're collaborating and communicating with each other as they try to find vulnerabilities in devices, and then they're using Black Hat and other very similar conferences to bring public light to not only their work, because this is their livelihood and they're trying to get the market presence, if you will, but they're also trying as part of their livelihood to sort of demonstrate to the public where these vulnerabilities exist, both in a way to call out corporations, because it is a tendency of corporations to try to sort of keep those vulnerabilities to themselves, to try to keep everybody honest, and they'll bring those to public light during these conferences. It is very important that they be given the deference to do this. I think researchers like this are unfettered by sort of the corporate demands as corporate citizens behave in a certain way. I think these individual researchers are not fettered by the same rules. So they have the ability to sort of chase these vulnerabilities in a way that I think corporations do not.
All right, thanks, Don. So let's go to our questions on the next slide, if we could. And the first thing that our CISO wants to know is what is the CVD process and how are portals involved? I'll start off on that, and I'll invite Luke to jump in just a second. But the way we would talk to a client about this, or I think the Alvarez firm would talk to a client about this, is that in responding to a vulnerability or a suggestion that you have a vulnerability, a company like BeatPro is definitely going to have, let's say, at least 2 swim lanes running in parallel. And the response process is real time. It's very pressured. It's very fast. But swim lane number 1 is forensic and technical. Do we really have a vulnerability? And if so, how do we fix it? And that's a complicated, fact-intensive process. Running in parallel with that, your CISO and your general counsel are going to start talking from day one about whether we have legal obligations of mandatory disclosure. Are there regulators who we might be required to talk to? Are there counterparties who we might have contract requirements to talk to? If we're a public company, might we have a securities law obligation of disclosure? If the vulnerability actually represents a breach of personal information, might we have obligations under US state law or HIPAA or GDPR, as Luke mentioned, actually go out and disclose to state regulators, to the affected consumers, or both to regulators in Europe or in other countries. So that's swim lane number 2. And when we talk about possibly adding a CVD policy to the mix, and if we could stay on slide 22, please. What we are really talking about is adding a 3rd swim lane, which is, should we in parallel be talking about making disclosures to peer companies and to affected regulators where we might not have strict legal obligations to do so. It may seem a little bit countercultural because you're talking about confidential security information, has patient safety consequences, reputational consequences, stock price consequences, et cetera. And we're talking now about sort of actively considering the value you get about bringing peer companies and regulators into a discussion of the vulnerability and how it's been remediated. So that's sort of the process in a nutshell, is adding that third swim lane while you are working the other two. And Luke, do you want to say a little bit about portals and how they fit?
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about bringing in other stakeholders, Jeremy, when Paul said at the beginning that it's better to have a policy than not, I would just put one important caveat on that, obviously it's going to be on our CISO's mind and should be on the general counsel's and others' minds as they think about setting this up, which is having a policy written down that you don't really follow or that isn't positioned for you to be able to act on the reports that will come in from the security researchers and the public at large actually may be worse than having no policy at all or no CVD program at all. You really are charged with the knowledge that you receive through that process. Now, it's a good thing, a great thing to have that knowledge, but once you have it, you have the responsibility to act and act timely on the potential risks involved. And so when Jeremy's talking about the other stakeholders and executives in the process, this is where we as a cybersecurity team and working with companies across sectors often see things break down. That it will be a compliance issue that it's viewed as, and InfoSec is doing their thing. Legal is over here unaware of all of the technical implications and risks. There is not anyone to sort of bring the process together. So it's really important that in addition to the paper and following what's on the paper and the policy, that there be this multi-lens, cross-functional view of the issue. But I wanted to ask John, who's here with us. I mean, John, you're someone on the cutting edge of technology and risk issues advising major companies across sectors. As you think about a CVD portal and a CISO's mindset in approaching it, what are the security issues that should be thought of top level?
Sure. The portal usually touches both the internet and the corporate network, right? So we need to be sure that, one, we've bifurcated the two so that we're providing the necessary internet protections for the portal, so that as the public, including those people who have malicious intent, are touching those portals, that beyond the portal, they can't touch our corporate network. One of the things that we're concerned about through medical device vulnerabilities is the effect on the corporate network through development and through the R&D phase. And do we bring badness from our corporate network onto the medical devices we program it? So we have the same concern with the portal that we do sort of the corporate network, is to make sure that we've excised that portal in a way that it cannot communicate in any way with the corporate network. And so we don't put a basement out there for the bad guys to come in and to touch our corporate network.
When you reference the Black Hat conference, can you say what a Black Hat is, and should the CISO put on their black hat, so to speak, in thinking about how a bad guy would attack a portal like this?
Sure. So black hat, I mean, these terms have sort of taken on their own life in the past several years, and I hear the term black hat and white hat. In the very formal definition of the conference, black hat is a conference of folks with similar-minded directions for providing hacking and hacking vulnerability protections for companies and the bad guys alike. So there's very little difference between who might attend the black hat conference. When we talk about the mentality of a black hat versus a white hat, the black hat's intentions are typically malicious. So you would want to think like a bad guy when you wanted to protect your portal, just in the way that you might want to think like a bad guy when you're trying to protect your home. How might I protect the house?
And then maybe you consider what's called penetration testing or pen testing to do actual live efforts to see if you can break the security that you've set up?
Absolutely. We want to consider every possible motive and or vector for penetration that the bad guy might undertake, every one of his methodologies. We would want to consider all of those, keeping ourselves close to the tactics of the black hats. As a white hat in a corporation or a medical device manufacturer is a paramount position to take.
And in terms of the resources that you could consult and consider it, obviously there's the MDIC report that Alvarez and Debevoise have been part of putting together, but there's also the MITRE report that Pamela referenced and Randy referenced that might provide good technical insights on these issues.
Absolutely, and they've undertaken the CVSS and the fact that that vulnerability scoring system wasn't designed with medical devices in mind, and there's been a major attempt by MITRE to retool the CVSS so that it properly reflects the concerns of medical devices.
Let me ask you the ultimate question, which is this too risky to set up, or can this be done safely?
It can absolutely be done safely, yes.
It's just a question of going through the right considerations and steps to set it up properly.
We would want to have the same risk tolerance discussions that we would have in any other particular aspect of our company.
Understood. Jeremy,
So,
back to you.
great, thanks, Luke and John. So the portal, important to note, is think of it as a two-way street. This is where you're going to post and convey information, sensitive information about security vulnerabilities to other stakeholders in the industry and the regulatory community, but it's also how you're going to receive comparable information from them. And that really takes us to the question of buy-in and how do you sell, if you're the CISO or the general counsel, how do you sell the idea to your other stakeholders that doing this kind of sharing is a good thing? And probably the simplest point to make to those other stakeholders is that if you give, you shall receive. And joining into a well-managed CVD process means joining a larger ecosystem of other companies that are doing the same thing. And so that your company, its reputation, its stock price, your patients, and their safety will all ultimately be enhanced if you can get past that initial sort of counterintuitive sense of, oh my goodness, this is sensitive internal stuff. And it belongs strictly inside the four walls of our company. So that's a good message to convey to your C-suite, to your board, and the other stakeholders, compliance department, and so forth, who are going to need to be part of your CVD process. With that, maybe just in the interest of time, we should jump ahead to phase 2 of our hypo, which is on the next slide. And here we get the first real-world test of BeatPro's new CVD program, because Mr. Red Teamer, our independent security researcher, has been in touch with the company and claims that he has detected a vulnerability that would actually allow several of the pacemaker models to be turned off remotely. And he provides evidence of this, proof of life, as we say in cyber lingo, showing that this is, in his view, a real threat. And he's not just being patient and completely a good citizen about this. He's saying, if you don't notify the public, BeatPro, I will. I'll take this to the regulators. So we've got our CVD policy in place, and on slide 12, we've got some questions about what's actually going on here. Luke, why don't you start out just by talking a little bit about engagement with the researcher and what we learned in our research process for the report about how companies in the MDM community might want to handle that.
Absolutely. The researchers that are at the top level of this tend to be extremely professional. So they're both technically very capable, but they're also, from our experience, extremely well-intentioned and straightforward. And the overriding message that we got is try to be as transparent as possible and responsive to them as you can be. Where they start to become your enemy as a manufacturer is if they feel that their concerns are not being taken seriously, they're being brushed off, they're being dragged along and dragged out from a timing sense. I think a key is relationship management, communication, respect. One thing they made very clear is please don't offer them money in exchange for going away and not outing the vulnerability. They're not interested in that. The people that we spoke with were big on the integrity aspects of this. So those are some of the high points.
Okay. And John, talk a little bit about just the pace of this. How fast is this going to move? How much time do we have to solve this problem?
Usually very quickly. There's a lot of impatience with these folks, right? This is because they spend all of their time deep in this technology. Things move very quickly for them, and as such, they respond similar. So they are looking for a very quick response. I think one of the things that they expect out of manufacturer, whether it be medical device or some other kind of manufacturer, is a quick response, because if they don't feel one of the things that they like to check off on their box is the sort of reciprocal nature of the relationship with the device manufacturer. And if they don't feel that that's true, they'll immediately turn to either the public domain or the regulator to tell their message.
Okay. And by the way, we talked about not paying them to go away. In our experience, these folks don't necessarily mind getting paid, but they want to get paid in a responsible way. And it's increasingly common to see large companies have bug bounty programs, as they're called, which provide guardrails around when payments will and won't be made. And just like CVD policies, those are best written down in advance, sometimes publicly promulgated, sometimes not, but you always want to have that as a reference point. And that's another type of decision that you absolutely do not want to be making on an ad hoc basis. So we also ask on the slide, what initial steps do you take to address the vulnerability? And there, I think what we would say is it's a sort of a blended technical and legal response, but technical coming first there for a reason. The key issues being, do you really have a vulnerability? Someone's got to pressure test the evidence that our security researcher has provided and find out, if we really have a problem on our hands, or if we have, a false positive, an indication that doesn't bear out. And that's a process that ought to be led by the technical team, but with close involvement from the legal team, because of that laundry list of legal risks that Paul and Luke outlined for you earlier. The fact is that if this turns out to be the real deal, a serious vulnerability, it's going to have an immediate technical remediation phase, but it's going to have a legal afterlife that could go on for months, or I regret to say even years, of investigations, lawsuits, regulatory inquiries, congressional hearings, and so forth. So you want the lawyers in the room and providing guidance, and perhaps even being involved in the engagement of a cyber forensics expert like John's firm to help figure out the technical issues. With that, why don't we jump to slide 13. I'm sorry, 25. I'm looking at a different numbering system here. Can we go one slide forward, please? So now the testing that we just talked about has been done. And the testing essentially confirms we do have a problem, but that the problem requires such a high level of sophistication that it's not clear how serious the risk really is in the real world. And as any cybersecurity expert like John will tell you, the world is full of nothing but vulnerabilities in a sense. And so companies, including MDMs, are constantly faced with decisions about, how serious is the risk associated with a particular vulnerability, and how much investment really needs to be made in remediating the vulnerability that's in front of you right now, as opposed to another that also requires attention. So we now have, go ahead, Luke, jump in, please.
I thought maybe we could take advantage of Dr. Schwartz being on from FDA, if you're there, Suzanne, just to briefly talk about the timeframes with controlled and uncontrolled risks, the 30 and 60 clocks, and how that comes into play here.
Sure, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so when we put together a post-market guidance, we outlined an approach for controlled vulnerabilities, as well as what we considered uncontrolled risk vulnerabilities that, given if they were to be exploited, that the risk to patient harm was really unacceptable, and therefore would require some type of measure to reduce that risk, whether it's an initial mitigation or countermeasure or a more permanent remediation, what that would look like. And our interest again on cybersecurity is really to move quickly, and what could we do at FDA to try to incentivize that process to be expedient. And so for vulnerabilities of uncontrolled risk, we outlined a process of incentive that if certain criteria could be met, that the manufacturer would not need to go the course of Part 806, corrections and removals or recall, because it would essentially, the measure that would have to be taken would essentially be a correction or removal, in that you're taking an action with that device that is going to essentially reduce the risk to what would be then an acceptable level. And the criteria that we talked about there were that within 30 days of a manufacturer identifying or being informed of a vulnerability of uncontrolled risk, that the manufacturer is able to put, again, a mitigation in place that would reduce that risk to an acceptable level, and communicate around that through a kind of process of disclosure in terms of what that assessment has revealed, and that within 60 days a more permanent kind of remediation, a more permanent fix would be put in place. So that's a time element there. The other criteria that have to be met for such an incentive would be that there's no knowledge or evidence that the vulnerability was actually exploited, and therefore there is no knowledge or awareness of an adverse event, an injury or a death that has occurred. And then the last element being that the manufacturer be a participant, an active participant and member in an information sharing analysis organization that was stood up specifically for sharing around medical device vulnerabilities, and that by virtue of sharing the disclosure, the communication that the manufacturer is transmitting, is submitting to its customers, and also then sharing that information broadly within the ISAL, that were those criteria all addressed, all met, that Part 806 reporting of corrections and removals would not be enforced. One thing I'll make a note of here, which has been, again, our observation in our discussions working with manufacturers since the post-market guidance has been finalized, is that the difficulty, the real hard nut to crack is this or is this not uncontrolled? And some might say, well, it's in the eyes of the beholder, whether you consider that risk to be uncontrolled or not. And if it takes too long to figure out that assessment when the vulnerability is first identified or brought to manufacturer's attention, then that entire window of opportunity, that 30, 60-day window, quickly dissipates, and then you're kind of forced into a position of potentially, needing to undergo the 806 reporting. So what some manufacturers, have taken as their position operationally, and again, this is just, from what we have heard, is that they have for themselves adopted a policy of when a vulnerability is brought to its attention, when they are informed by an outside researcher or hospital or elsewhere, other identifier of vulnerability, they immediately assume it's uncontrolled. From time zero, they make an assumption as soon as that information comes in, this is uncontrolled, so that they're setting the clock from that point forward, and that were they then, as they're going through the assessment, make a determination that, no, actually, we do believe that this is controlled, then, then that's great. Then they're going down a different track. But at least then that kind of already puts them in a position to be able to take advantage of the 30-60-day time frame, were to indeed be validated and verified to be an uncontrolled risk vulnerability.
Jeremy, do you want to take us ahead in this scenario?
Let's jump ahead 2 slides then, please. Okay, so now our security researcher is getting a little impatient. He feels that the company hasn't responded to him quickly enough. And a month has passed, and he says, okay, I'll give you another week, and after that, I'm going public. And that could involve a Twitter post, for example, which is something we dealt with in a real-world scenario for a client very recently. It could involve a blog post. It could involve a report to a well-known blog in the area called Krebs on Security. There are any number of ways that Mr. Red Teamer can get this information out into the world in today's social media environment. So that leads us to the questions on the next slide. And Luke, I'm going to ask you to jump back in here and talk about the importance of communications strategy and how best to deal with a world where you can't necessarily control the messaging.
Yeah, I would say when a cyber incident or significant vulnerability becomes public, I probably spend 50 to 60% of my time on communications related issues. And this is often really underappreciated by companies in terms of how much bandwidth that's going to take up and how much planning really can help in that process. So here you've been given a specific deadline by the researcher. They're likely to go public in any of the ways that Jeremy mentioned. What is our communication strategy and across stakeholders? We've got our investors, we've got our regulators, we have our board and C-suite, we have the general public. And so all of those need to be taken into consideration in terms of how we stage communications. Oftentimes, we don't know. You see this with breaches that we've worked on over the years and other public breaches, for example, Equifax, where company comes out with facts and then they change a day or two later and they have to recant on some of those statements. And that really is damaging the credibility in the public eye and with regulators and others. So there's a strategy here to conveying proactiveness, responsiveness, a customer, patient, client first approach without getting over your skis in terms of facts that you don't know.
Okay. And there's another question we put out here, which is whether the government might be helpful. And we want to bring in the law enforcement angle here in particular. Luke, in a previous life, you ran all the major cyber investigations at the U.S. Department of Justice. Is there a role in this response process for your former colleagues?
Well, yeah, they are very helpful in terms of providing threat vulnerability information. As Paul said, there are situations where they'll look perhaps to prosecute, a company under certain circumstances. Here, we seem to be far away from any sort of situation because we are trying to respond and deal with a vulnerability that we had no awareness of. So it's not that sort of situation. I think we may be a little bit early in going to them, but I suspect that later in the phase, we're going to reach a situation where we do want to reach out to our colleagues in law enforcement.
Okay, and I just emphasized before we move on to the next part of the scenario, when we ask on the slide, should you prepare public or other stakeholder communications, in a well-managed incident response process and plan, you actually began preparing those communications probably long ago before you were in the context of this specific scenario. And you created sort of shell versions of the main communications messages that you might need to use with various stakeholders, ranging from the C-suite to the board to the media, to your shareholders and your regulators. And what you're doing at this point is taking those, as to which you've already spent a lot of time, gotten buy-in from all your internal participants, and you are dusting them off and freshening them up and working them to update them to actually match the facts of the particular situation. If you're starting from scratch at this point in the scenario, that's actually not a terrific place to be. So with that, let's jump to the next slide, please. And now we've got our vulnerability actually solved and patched. We've got disclosures that have been issued through the key regulators, FDA and the Department of Homeland Security. We should pause on for 1 second. Federal agency with a major role to play in this process and in partnership with FDA and others in the public sector. DHS, for example, runs one of the main portals through which cyber threat information can be reported. DHS would then go through a process of assessing your report and broadcasting it out to the right stakeholders, ISAs, ISACs, individual companies, and so forth. So DHS has a key role to play here. Moving along, we've got a new issue from a different researcher who is finding your data, your private patient data, actually showing up on what's called the dark web. It's available for sale to bad guys selling it to bad guys, and it includes a lot of sensitive and detailed personal information, including information that is personally identifiable, biometric data, socials, names, addresses, and so forth. And this is for U.S. persons, and thinking about the GDPR again, a lot of EU residents as well. So let's first pause and talk about the dark web, another bit of jargon for everybody. John DeCrane, talk about the dark web and what it is and what goes on there.
Sure. The dark web is exactly like what we refer to as the bright web, the internet. The dark web is simply a large collection, maybe larger than the bright web, a collection of end machines or end domains, websites that are hosted that are only accessible through an alternative set of browsers and or other technologies. So to generalize, if I wanted to get to a dark web site, I would use a Tor browser or some alternative browser where I can simply type in that URL, and then technologies in that alternative browser will take me to that website destination on the dark web. It's as simple as getting to a dark website as it's getting to a bright website.
What sorts of things?
And John,
so since there's very little monitoring by the government, it's very hard to sort of get on that wire and pay attention to that. There basically is no limit to the activity. It is where folks cannot behave in the bright light, they behave in the dark light, which is similar to most bad guys, right? Some behave in the dark where they're not being observed.
So is it conceivable that people are trading in vulnerabilities with systems and even perhaps medical devices there, along with patient and other personally identifiable information?
I would say that's a reality. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And John, in our scenario here, we've got healthcare data actually available for sale. Talk a little bit about the value of that on the real dark web. Is this really happening, and why do the bad guys want this kind of information in particular?
Sure. I mean, I think there are all kinds of ways to monetize that data in its aggregate. You could monetize that data from a usage standpoint. In other words, if we knew all these patients were taking a certain medication, it might be used to bully a pharmaceutical manufacturer. It could be used to expose a certain individual who has a public life, given a diagnosis that individual may not wanted to have made public. So there are a bunch of ways this data is valuable and can be monetized.
Yeah, and we see metrics showing that healthcare records go for high multiples of, for example, a credit card number, because they can support this wide range of attack vectors and uses that John outlines. So let's talk, going to the next slide, a little bit about some of the issues raised by this aspect of this scenario, starting with privacy. We obviously are dealing with the device, whether it's a pacemaker or any other form of medical device. It's not necessarily something that lives inside the patient and provides active reporting. It could be something that's connected to a hospital bed. The average hospital bed, we've seen data in the US today, has about 15 internet connected devices associated with it on average. So there's a lot of data being collected in a lot of different postures here. And that starts from a privacy perspective with asking whether the patient has been given appropriate notice and has given appropriate consent. under any privacy law regime, particularly GDPR, healthcare data is seen as being at a higher level of importance and sensitivity, and therefore being demanding a higher level of handling in terms of security and privacy practices. So we'd be looking, especially in the EU, for if we were to kind of back up to the beginning of the engagement with the patient, we'd be looking for, where possible, the clearest, most specific disclosures that can be made to the patient about what type of information is going to be collected and why, and who's going to hold it, and where it's going to be held geographically, especially if it's going to cross borders, because the EU frowns on that. And we're going to be asking whether the user, the consumer, has been given a meaningful opportunity to consent, and whether the user is going to have ongoing rights of access to their data. And those are things that GDPR takes very seriously, and where there are breaches of those, we see increasing severity in the enforcement community. There was a case just recently out of Portugal where a hospital was fined 400,000 euros, we believe the highest fine so far under GDPR. And what the hospital did wrong was simply misconfigured data access, so that every doctor and every social worker in the hospital could see all the data of every patient. There was no abuse of the data. It was just the fact that access hadn't been properly controlled that triggered the 400,000 euro fine for that hospital. So those are some of the privacy issues that have to be balanced against the obvious huge benefits to patient safety that come with modern medical devices. With that, we're going to just turn back to how you actually deal with the dark web scenario. And Luke, I want to bring you and your law enforcement expertise back in at this point.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, here we would definitely be advising a manufacturer to engage with law enforcement. This is typically, for example, through a team like ours, and John and Alvarez have many contacts as well, but we would be calling on trusted colleagues at the FBI or our foreign counterpart colleagues to be able to tell us about the dark web site, who frequents it, what is the track record of the seller, how do they usually exploit systems, how far is it likely to go. Sometimes we've been able to find out that the seller actually doesn't have the information and it's really a spoof. Sometimes we find out it's very real and that the implications are worse than we thought. So law enforcement, in addition to being able to intercede in some situations, is often able to give you a much better picture. And that takes me to a second point that we really have to consider. If we are publicly traded or we're going to do an IPO, those sorts of things, these are potentially material, non-public pieces of information about the vulnerability. If this is our crown jewel innovation or new product, medical device, and there could be a market moving effect, or even if it's material to a reasonable investor, which is really the bottom line test, we need to think about several serious considerations from the SEC's guidance on these issues, including whether we should close our internal trading window to prevent people in the know within the company about this non-public event from trading on their stock, even accidentally giving the appearance that they're trading on inside information. We're going to also have to think about our disclosures going forward from a securities perspective to make sure that we're being consistent with the messages to the market and making those mesh well with our public relations and communication strategy. We cannot be saying happy things in one channel and bad things and negative things in another channel and skewing the market that way.
Okay. And let's be clear, what's going on in our scenarios, we know that the data is out there, but in this part of our hypothetical, we haven't really talked about how the data got out there. I think that's an unknown. And so that triggers the same set of forensic and technical investigation obligations that we talked about earlier. And depending on what you learn there, we might be tying back in to our obligations under the CVD policies that our hypothetical company has now put in place. If we work back from this data that's out there on the dark web, figure out how it got there, find out what the attack vector was, we may find ourselves talking to FDA, talking to ISACs and ISAs, talking to DHS, and posting and receiving information through that portal that we talked about. We also have some other disclosure issues to consider here. We're talking about individual patient personal information. If you're a HIPAA covered entity or business associate, you're going to have obligations most likely to disclose to the Department of Health and Human Services, which, depending on the scale of the breach, may actually post public information on the HIPAA website that's known colloquially as the Wall of Shame. And because we've got individual PII, personal health, personally identifying information, as well as what HIPAA would call PHI, quite likely we've got obligations to disclose here to, in the US, to the attorneys general of many individual states and to customers, affected customers and patients in the states where they live. All 50 US states now have statutes that require disclosure, at least to the affected individuals, in many cases to state level regulators as well. And just rounding out under GDPR, the obligation there is to disclose to the lead privacy regulator in the country where you have your principal EU relationship or business within 72 hours. And in our experience, having seen about 6 months of enforcement activity under GDPR, regulators take that time clock very seriously. It begins to tick when you are, quote unquote, aware of the exposure of the data under GDPR. But they really do expect to hear from you sooner rather than later. And the easiest way to start off on the wrong foot with regulators is to get to them later than you should. In terms of enforcement and civil actions, there's the risk under GDPR that the European privacy regulators could investigate, could levy fines, like happened to that hospital in Portugal. Virtually every state attorney general in the US has enforcement authority here. So does HHS. If HIPAA is implicated, the list kind of goes on in addition to class action risk. So it's not uncommon after a major security event like this to see dozens even of competing civil litigations, regulatory investigations, and possibly law enforcement involvement as well.
Jeremy?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I know we're going to want to get into questions here in a second. And one of them that has come in is actually apropos of what you've been talking about. Someone has asked about medical device issues related to the CCPA in California. I don't know if you can give a brief primer on that and how it might play here.
I'll do my best to be brief in talking about the California statute, which is it's a little bit big. But what's happened here is that California just passed what amounts to sort of a U.S. version of GDPR, and it imposes all sorts of obligations on companies not to sell customer data, to allow an opt-out right sale of customer data, and to provide rights of access, correction, deletion to personal data. And it provides for statutory damages, which can add up in a hurry in the event of a data breach. So it's a very big development in U.S. privacy law. I would say the main issue where the CCPA, this new California law, intersects with the medical device manufacturer community is whether you're a HIPAA-covered entity or not, because there is an exemption, a big one, in the California statute for HIPAA-covered entities. So if you're generating this kind of data in a HIPAA-covered context, chances are pretty good that you're not going to have to worry about this otherwise very burdensome California law. If you are not a HIPAA-covered entity and you are sort of inside the CCPA, then you want to be thinking now, because the statute goes into effect in 2020, about a vigorous diligence, gap analysis, and remediation program to spot the obligations of the California law and how your policies and procedures might need to be adjusted in response. In a nutshell, the two big ones are likely to be what we're seeing with most clients. The two big areas of gaps are, do we have those robust procedures that allow customers to contact us, to report out to the customer what kind of data we're holding on them, and then to respond if the customer says, hey, correct that or delete it. That's a big operational task, which most companies aren't presently equipped for unless you're also doing GDPR compliance. And the second is this do not sell obligation, where companies are now going to be required to have a do not sell button on their home pages. which are going to require you to then carve out any identifiable customer data from any sale transaction, and sale is very broadly defined. It does not involve like a merger or change of control, but sort of sale of a data set is frowned upon. So I hope that's of some help. With that, just in the interest of time, why don't we jump ahead to the last part of our scenario? And this is what we call the worst case. Here we've got an actual pacemaker malfunction. Our patient survives, so in that sense, it's a happy ending. But now we've got, as you would expect, sort of that wave of litigation, specifically including litigation by the individual, alleging a flaw in the product. So Paul, do you want to pick up there and talk a little bit about the questions on the next slide?
Sure. Thank you, Jeremy. So we could spend a day talking about product liability, but I thought I could just highlight some of the key issues to think about from this perspective. First, there are three legal theories that you need to think about. The first one being negligence, which focuses on the conduct of the company. In essence, did the company act reasonably when designing the device and manufacturing it and developing warnings? So that negligence focuses on the conduct of the company. That's contrasted with the next legal theory, which is strict liability, which means regardless of the conduct of the company, did the company distribute a product that is in a defective condition, unreasonably dangerous? That's the term of art in most strict liability lawsuits. So under strict liability, a company can be liable even if it acted reasonably, and that's part of product liability law. And last, there's a breach of warranty exposure, which in essence is, did the company keep its promises, either express promises or implied? So those are the three legal theories. There are also three types of allegations that companies bring. A design defect allegation, which means that the company failed to design the device properly, meaning even if they manufactured it perfectly, the device would still lead to a potential consumer harm. The other possibility is a manufacturing defect, which means the device was designed appropriately. It just was the specific device was not manufactured in accordance with specifications. So the design was fine, but there was a manufacturing flaw or defect. And the third possibility is a failure to warn case, meaning the company had reason to believe there was a danger and failed to warn. Now, in these types of lawsuits, no matter which option we choose, there are defenses that are somewhat unique to this fact pattern involving medical device cybersecurity vulnerabilities. First, very often companies can argue that the product was actually not defective at all, in that the vulnerability in practice is not even capable of being deployed in a real-world scenario. So you do have an argument in many of these types of situations that there really is no actionable vulnerability, and in essence, the device is not defective. In addition, there's another interesting argument related to causation, because in essence, what you may have is a situation where there's intervening criminal behavior that leads to deployment of the vulnerability, and that can break the causal chain from a product liability perspective. So in general, many things to think about from a product liability perspective, but there are some unique aspects to medical device cybersecurity that companies should be aware of.
What does all of this say? I'm throwing this out to the group in terms of our CBD policy and what we should be preserving in terms of the steps we took to test, implement, respond to the researcher. I would imagine those things are going to be part of a civil discovery process in such a case.
That's right. I think you need to be very cognizant of the fact that all of the steps you employ are quite likely to be discoverable. Some things could be privileged if set up in a specific way and you act at the direction of counsel. But many of the parts of the CBD policy will not be privileged, will be discoverable. And I think, Luke, it goes to your point that when you develop a CBD policy, or frankly any policy under your standard operating procedures, one, you need to implement it, but two, you need to implement it carefully. And rushing through this to meet a deadline is certainly suboptimal and can be disastrous. from many different perspectives.
And this is John. One of the things I noticed in a previous slide is the Beat Pro CISO was asking themselves whether or not a hacker could undertake the realistic steps in order to realize the vulnerability. And I think if we're asking ourselves that question, we failed before we started. We should automatically assume the hackers have the ability to undertake those steps in order to realize the vulnerability, in so much as that a simple phishing scam may get them into the corporate network such that they may discover those secret steps in order to take over the vulnerability, just not the vulnerability itself. We must ask ourselves, are we completely secure life cycle wise such that we're preparing or protecting that vulnerability?
So that's a great point, John, and that the CVD policy sits within a larger cybersecurity ecosystem, both at the manufacturer and presumably at the medical provider as well, where it happens in the situations where it connects with that provider's network.
Yeah, anecdotally, so realizing sort of my hypothesis here, the programming device not being secured, but the medical device itself being secured, such that I would just steal the programming device, that I had full access to the device itself.
And putting on my civil litigator hat here, I would just underscore the linkage between operationalizing your CVD policy and preparing to defend against this wave of litigations and investigations. The priority has to be a candid, technically accurate, and complete response to the security risk. And as the lawyers, we absolutely never want to stand in the way of that. What we do want to encourage is that all the internal communication around those steps simply be kept as flat and neutral as possible, because you have to sort of assume with discovery, congressional investigations, and so forth, possibly coming down the road, that every text message, every email, every IM, et cetera, that you exchange with one another while you're going through your CVD steps is possibly going to be open to public scrutiny. So it's just a good idea to keep that communication flat, professional, not alarmist, just the facts, get it done. No adjectives, no adverbs is how I sometimes say it to clients.
Jeremy, thank you. This is Paul. We have 2 minutes left, so we thought we'd go to one quick question before we lose everyone at 12:30. And the question is, do you believe 60 days for making a permanent fix available is a realistic timeline? And I think that the reality is it can be challenging. And I think if you look at past precedents, companies sometimes have probably taken over 60 days. And in essence, I think, and I don't want to speak for Suzanne, and I know we're running out of time, but I think FDA has demonstrated and would be willing to demonstrate, some flexibility as long as the facts warrant it.
Yeah, this is Suzanne. So let me just quickly respond to that. Number one, we have seen manufacturers able to meet that time frame, but we also recognize that in certain situations it may be a challenge. And for that, just like with everything else that we deal with, we say, come speak to us early. Let's talk about what it would involve. What does that time frame look like, so that we can work together at the most expedient mitigation and remediation as possible. And in some of those cases, we will, again, evaluate on a case-by-case basis whether, that incentive can still stand as is with the manufacturer's best efforts in accelerating that process of remediation. Some cases not, but we will continue to look at that and reevaluate as time goes on.
Thank you, Suzanne. And we are actually exactly at 12:30 Eastern Time. And this was a very exciting session. And I thank all the panelists. And unfortunately, we had more questions, but we will try to include more information on our website. This webinar will be is recorded, and we will make it available online on MDIC website in a couple of days. And please sign up with the MDIC newsletter for upcoming announcements as well as opportunities for collaboration on various MDIC initiatives. Thank you, everyone.